Long before Hitler rose to power, European intellectuals had been developing theories about human differences. During the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists and philosophers attempted to classify humanity into distinct races, often ranking them hierarchically. These early racial theorists, working in an era before modern genetics, made observations based on physical characteristics like skin color, skull measurements, and facial features. The Enlightenment, despite its emphasis on reason, produced thinkers who categorized humans into racial groups. French philosopher Arthur de Gobineau wrote an essay on inequality of the human races in the 1850s, arguing that the Aryan race was superior and that racial mixing led to civilizational decline. These ideas spread throughout Europe, finding particularly receptive audiences in Germany and Austria. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in 1859, was quickly misapplied to human societies. Social Darwinism emerged as a distortion of evolutionary theory, suggesting that human races competed for survival just as animal species did. Proponents argued that stronger races would naturally dominate weaker ones, and that this process was not only inevitable but desirable for human progress. Herbert Spencer, a British philosopher, coined the phrase survival of the fittest and applied evolutionary concepts to societies. German intellectuals enthusiastically adopted these ideas, interpreting them to mean that nations and races were locked in eternal struggle where only the strongest would prevail. This created an intellectual framework where racial competition seemed scientifically justified. The term Aryan originally referred to ancient Indo-Iranian peoples who spoke related languages. European linguists in the 19th century studied these language families and began speculating about the people who spoke them. Through a series of intellectual leaps and misinterpretations, Aryan became associated with supposed master race of ancient conquerors. German nationalists became fascinated with the idea that they descended from these ancient Aryans. They imagined pure, noble people who had originated in Northern Europe, or even in mythical lands like Atlantis. This Aryan race was credited with creating all major civilizations: ancient Greece, Rome, India, and Persia. Any achievements of non-European peoples were explained away as the result of ancient Aryan influence or conquest. Germany entered World War I in 1914 with confidence and patriotic fervor. For years later, the nation faced crushing defeat. The German army had fought on foreign soil throughout the war, and many German civilians couldn't comprehend how their military had lost. No foreign armies occupied German territory, making the defeat seem inexplicable to ordinary citizens. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany. The nation lost territory, faced severe military restrictions, and was saddled with enormous reparation payments. Perhaps most painfully, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. This created deep resentment and a sense of national humiliation that would fester for years. To explain the inexplicable defeat, many Germans embraced the Doxtasagen, or stab in the back myth. This conspiracy theory claimed that Germany's army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed from within. According to this narrative, socialists, communists, and especially Jews had undermined the war effort through strikes, protests, and defeatist propaganda. This myth provided a psychologically comforting explanation for defeat. Rather than accepting that Germany had been outfought and outproduced by the Allies, believers could maintain faith in German military prowess, while blaming internal enemies. The myth was factually groundless. The German military leadership had requested an armistice because they faced imminent collapse, but became widely accepted. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government established after the war, faced crisis after crisis. Hyperinflation in 1923 destroyed the savings of the middle class. A worker's weekly wages might become worthless in days. People carried money in wheelbarrows to buy bread. Lifetime savings evaporated overnight. This economic trauma created desperate search for explanations and solutions. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, hit Germany particularly hard. Unemployment soared to over 30%. Desperate poverty became widespread. Democratic institutions seemed incapable of addressing the crisis. In this atmosphere of desperation and fear, extremist parties offering simple explanations and radical solutions gained support. Adolf Hitler's ideology, outlined in his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, written in 1925, placed race at the center of history and politics. Hitler believed that all of human history could be understood as a struggle between races for survival and dominance. In this Darwinian nightmare, only the strongest races would survive, and compassion or cooperation between races was a dangerous weakness. Hitler identified the Aryan race, by which he meant Germanic peoples, as the creators of all culture and civilization. In his view, Aryans possessed unique qualities of creativity, organizational ability, and idealism that distinguished them from all other peoples. He claimed that every significant human achievement, from ancient architecture to modern technology, ultimately derived from Aryan genius. Nazi ideology constructed an elaborate racial hierarchy with Aryans at the top and various groups ranked below. Immediately beneath Germans were other Nordic peoples, Scandinavians, Dutch, and English. Southern Europeans occupied a lower tier, followed by Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, who Nazis considered racially inferior, though still European. Non-Europeans ranked lower in this pseudo-scientific ranking. Africans and other colonized peoples were deemed racially backward. But the Nazis reserved special hatred for Jews, who occupied a unique position in their ideology, not simply as an inferior race, but as an active threat to Aryan purity and civilization. The Nazis claimed scientific authority for their racial beliefs. They established institutes for racial research and employed anthropologists, biologists, and physicians to provide academic credentials for their ideology. These so-called scientists measured skulls, cataloged physical features, and produced elaborate racial classifications. Eugenics, the pseudo-scientific belief that humanity could be improved through selective breeding, provided another pillar of Nazi racial ideology. Eugenics movements existed in many countries during this period, including the United States. But the Nazis took these ideas to horrific extremes. They implemented programs to sterilize people deemed genetically unfit, and eventually moved to systematic murder of those considered life unworthy of life. Jews occupied a special place in Nazi demonology. Hitler portrayed Jews not simply as racially inferior, but as an active, malevolent force working to destroy Aryan civilization. He claimed Jews controlled international finance, spread communism, corrupted culture through modernist art and literature, and promoted racial mixing to weaken other peoples. This anti-Semitic conspiracy theory drew on centuries of European prejudice against Jews, but intensified and radicalized it. Traditional Christian anti-Semitism had condemned Jews for religious reasons, but Nazi racial anti-Semitism declared Jewishness an immutable biological characteristic that could never be changed through conversion or assimilation. This made Nazi anti-Semitism far more dangerous and ultimately genocidal. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a comprehensive campaign to instill Nazi racial ideology into every aspect of German life. The regime controlled newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and publishing. This monopoly on information meant Germans received constant reinforcement of Nazi racial messages, while alternative viewpoints were suppressed. Goebbels understood that effective propaganda must be simple, emotional, and repetitive. Rather than complex arguments, Nazi propaganda relied on striking images, memorable slogans, and emotional appeals. The swastika, the Hitler salute, and mass rallies created powerful visual and emotional experiences that bypassed rational analysis. The Nazis recognized that shaping young minds was crucial to long-term success. They reformed the education system to emphasize racial ideology from elementary school onward. Textbooks were rewritten to include racial content in every subject. Mathematics problems might calculate the cost of caring for disabled people. Biology classes taught racial classification. History lessons portrayed German history as a racial struggle. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls enrolled millions of young people in organizations that combined outdoor activities, military-style discipline, and ideological instruction. Children learned to identify different racial types, memorize Nazi racial theory, and participate in activities designed to build racial consciousness and loyalty to the Nazi state. Nazi propaganda relied heavily on visual imagery to communicate racial messages. Posters, films, and exhibitions portrayed Aryans as strong, beautiful, healthy, and heroic, typically shown as blonde, blue-eyed, athletic figures in heroic poses. These idealized images reinforce the idea that Germans belonged to superior physical type. Conversely, Jews and others deemed inferior were systematically dehumanized through caricature and distortion. The notorious film The Eternal Jew portrayed Jews as diseased rats spreading corruption. Newspaper cartoons exaggerated facial features to make Jews appear monstrous or subhuman. This visual dehumanization made it psychologically easier for Germans to accept discriminatory policies and eventually mass murder. The Nazis understood that many Germans respected scientific and medical authority. They therefore recruited doctors, scientists, and academics to provide expert validation for racial policies. Physicians implemented forced sterilization programs. Anthropologists certified racial classifications. Psychiatrists selected disabled patients for murder in the euthanasia program. This participation by educated professionals provided a veneer of legitimacy to racial policies. When respected doctors and professors endorsed racial ideology, many ordinary Germans found it easier to accept these ideas. The corruption of medical and scientific ethics during this period represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of these professions. For many Germans, especially those struggling economically or feeling adrift in modern society, Nazi racial ideology offered powerful psychological benefits. Being told you belonged to a superior race provided a sense of identity and self-worth regardless of personal circumstances. An unemployed worker might have lost his job, but he still possessed racial superiority, something that could never be taken away. This appeal was particularly strong for those who felt displaced or threatened by modern life. The Weimar Republic's social freedom, cultural experimentation, and democratic chaos unsettled many traditional Germans. Nazi ideology offered clear identities, rigid hierarchies, and simple explanations for complex problems. It promised to restore Germany to imagined past glory. Human psychology often seeks simple explanations for misfortune and clear targets for blame. Germany's post-war troubles, economic collapse, political instability, perceived cultural decay, demanded explanation. Nazi racial ideology provided a comprehensive answer. Jews and other racial enemies had caused these problems. This scapegoating served multiple psychological functions. It absolved Germans of responsibility for their nation's problems. It transformed complex economic and political issues into a simple story of racial conflict. It channeled anger and frustration toward specific targets, and it suggested a solution. Eliminating racial enemies would restore German greatness. As Nazi ideology became dominant, social pressure to conform became intense. Those who questioned racial ideology faced ostracism, job loss, or worse. Conversely, those who enthusiastically embraced Nazi beliefs gained social approval and potential advancement. This created powerful incentives for public compliance, even among those who privately harbored doubts. Psychologists have documented how social pressure can lead people to publicly endorse beliefs they privately question. The famous Asch conformity experiments, conducted after the war, demonstrated how individuals would give obviously wrong answers to simple questions if surrounded by people giving those wrong answers. Nazi Germany represented conformity pressure on a societal scale. The most extreme Nazi policies, systematic genocide, were not implemented immediately. The regime moved gradually, testing each step and acclimating the population to increasingly radical measures. This incremental progression made each new escalation seem less shocking. The process began with propaganda and social discrimination, moved to legal restrictions and economic boycotts, then forced emigration, then ghettoization, and finally systematic murder. At each stage, those who had accepted previous measures found it psychologically easier to accept the next step. By the time the final solution began, millions of Germans had been desensitized to increasingly extreme anti-Semitic policies. In 1935, the Nazi regime codified racial ideology into law with the Nuremberg Laws. These laws defined who counted as Jewish based on ancestry rather than religion, stripped Jews of German citizenship, and prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and those of German blood. These laws provided a pseudo-legal framework for systematic discrimination. The laws required Germans to prove their racial ancestry. Genealogical research became crucial, and those who could document pure Aryan ancestry received certificates. This bureaucratic process normalized racial classification and made Germans complicit in the system by requiring their participation in documenting racial identity. The Nazi regime implemented eugenics programs aimed at improving the supposed racial quality of the German people. The law for prevention of genetically diseased offspring, passed in 1933, mandated forced sterilization of people with conditions deemed hereditary, including mental illness, physical disabilities, alcoholism, and other conditions. Approximately 400,000 people were sterilized under this program. The logic was grimly consistent with Nazi racial ideology. The Aryan race must be protected from genetic contamination. Those deemed genetically unfit, even if ethnically German, threatened racial purity. This program also served as a stepping stone to more extreme policies, including the murder of disabled people in the so-called euthanasia program. Nazi ideology held that the superior Aryan race needed Lebensraum, living space, to thrive and multiply. Hitler believed Germany must expand eastward, conquering territory from the supposedly inferior Slavic peoples. This concept directly led to World War II and the genocidal occupation policies in Eastern Europe. The invasion of Poland and the Soviet Union were not merely military campaigns, but racial ideological projects. Nazi planners envisioned depopulating vast areas through murder and forced deportation, replacing Slavic inhabitants with German settlers. Millions of civilians died in pursuit of this racial territorial vision, demonstrating how Nazi racial ideology directly translated into genocidal policy. The ultimate expression of Nazi racial ideology was the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed racially or socially undesirable. This genocide represented Nazi racial ideology taken to its logical, horrific conclusion. The Holocaust required massive organizational effort, technological resources, and the participation or acquiescence of millions of Germans and their collaborators. The fact that Nazi racial ideology could motivate or justify such evil demonstrates the deadly power of pseudoscientific racism combined with totalitarian state power. Understanding why Germans believed in racial superiority requires recognizing the comprehensiveness of Nazi indoctrination. From schools to workplaces, from radio broadcasts to local Nazi party meetings, Germans received constant reinforcement of racial ideology. Dissenting voices were silenced through censorship, intimidation, and violence. In such an environment, independent critical thinking becomes extremely difficult. When every source of information confirms the same messages, when questioning those messages brings punishment, and when everyone around you appears to believe them, maintaining skepticism requires extraordinary courage and independent judgment. Research on obedience and conformity conducted after World War II, including Stanley Milgram's famous experiments, revealed disturbing truths about human behavior. Ordinary people, when ordered by authority figures, proved willing to inflict pain on others. When surrounded by peers doing likewise, compliance increased further. These findings don't excuse participation in Nazi crimes, but they help explain how ordinary Germans became complicit in extraordinary evil. Human moral resistance to wrongdoing is more fragile than we might wish. In the right circumstances, authoritarian pressure, gradual escalation, dehumanizing ideology, and social conformity, many people will participate in actions they would otherwise find abhorrent. It's crucial to note that not all Germans embraced Nazi racial ideology. Resistance movements, though small and often crushed, existed throughout the Nazi period. Individuals helped Jews escape, distributed anti-Nazi literature, and even attempted to assassinate Hitler. After the war, many Germans claimed they had never believed the ideology, though how many genuinely resisted versus remained passive, or only turned against Nazism after defeat remains debated. The existence of resistance demonstrates that Nazi indoctrination wasn't totally effective, and that individuals could maintain moral clarity even under intense pressure. However, resistors represented a small minority, and most paid with their lives for their courage. The Nazi belief in racial superiority emerged from a toxic combination of pseudoscience, historical grievances, political manipulation, psychological vulnerabilities, and totalitarian control. It wasn't simply imposed from above, but found resonance with existing prejudices, offered psychological comfort during the crisis, and promised restoration of national greatness. Understanding this history serves crucial purposes for contemporary society. It reveals how pseudoscience can be weaponized for political purposes, how prejudice can escalate into genocide, how ordinary people can be induced to participate in extraordinary evil, and how democratic institutions can collapse when citizens value security and belonging over liberty and truth. The Nazi experience demonstrates that believing oneself superior, whether based on race, nationality, religion, or ideology, creates permission for atrocity. When we dehumanize others, when we explain away their suffering as deserved, when we prioritize our group's interests over universal human rights, we walk paths that can lead towards similar darkness. Modern genetics has definitively disproven Nazi racial ideology. Humans share over 99.9% genetic similarity. The concept of discrete biological races has no scientific validity. Human genetic variation exists on gradual continua, not in sharp racial categories. There is no Aryan race, no master race, no racial hierarchy, just one human family with superficial physical variations. Yet racist ideologies persist, often using updated language and pseudoscience. Vigilance against such beliefs requires education about history, critical thinking about claims of group superiority, support for democratic institutions that protect minorities, and personal courage to oppose prejudice even when socially costly. The Nazis believed they were the superior race because they wanted to believe it, because they were taught to believe it, because their society punished disbelief, and because believing it served psychological, social, and political functions. This belief led to perhaps the greatest crime in human history. Preventing such tragedies requires understanding not just that the Nazis were wrong, but how and why millions came to believe such dangerous falsehoods, and maintaining our own resistance to similar thinking in whatever forms it appears today.